I will explain how to expose your videos correctly using 5 different tools that you can find in your camera or an external monitor. A histogram, a grade card, that's actually a physical thing, zebras, waveform scopes, and false color. Let's say you're just starting out and you don't have the money yet to buy an external monitor, but you have a decent camera, a DSLR or a mirrorless. Some cameras have a histogram only, like my Canon EOS R, and that's a nice tool to have when you're just starting out. But it's not so precise like the next ones that I will talk about in this video. Anyway, the histogram is the first tool you need to understand. It can offer you a good starting point to make sure you avoid having pure black or pure white pixels in your shot. Don't judge your exposure just by looking at your LCD screen on the back of the camera. You can be tricked so easily, especially when you shoot a video on a sunny day, on a bright day. So very simply explained, the exposure on a histogram is represented by some mountains and hills. Let's take this indoor shot as an example. On the left side, you will have the shadows, the midtones in the center, and the highlights on the right side. You don't want to expose your shot on the far left like this because you will have pure black pixels in the image. You also don't want to expose to the far right completely because you will have pure white areas which you can't recover. Your exposure should look something like this, where you don't lose any details in the shadows or highlights, so you can tweak them more easily in post-production. Because you shoot video, I recommend you to change the exposure by either changing your ISO, by adjusting the power of the light, or by changing the aperture value. The shutter speed should always be locked in at double of your frame rate. I mostly shoot in 24 frames per second, so the shutter speed will always be at 1/50th of a second. I mentioned the gray card as another tool to set the exposure on video, and this is what I use for a while now. It's the spider checker from Datacolor, a very precise tool for both photography and videography that will help you set the exposure and white balance as well. The coolest thing is that I can flip one of these charts, and on the back I will find this bigger 50% gray card that helps me find a good exposure when recording video. So with the shutter speed and aperture locked in, I set the ISO on auto, filling the entire frame with the 50% gray part, and half press on the shutter button on my Canon camera. As you can see, the ISO value appeared on the bottom right, and now I can set it manually to be at this constant value while filming. Keep in mind that the gray card needs to be in the same environment where you are recording your video. And if you change locations, you will need to use it again if the lighting conditions change during this time. Now, the following tools that I will talk about next are not available on my Canon EOS R, and this is why I use an external monitor connected to the camera. It's called Andyscene A6 Plus, and it has zebras, waveform scopes, and false color. All these tools are more precise than a histogram in my opinion, so if you have the money, consider investing in a monitor like this and you won't regret it. It's far more cheap than other monitors on the market, but it does the job really well, so I'm really happy that I own it. By the way, I will link all the products that I talk about in this video down in the description so you can check them out. Let's talk about zebras. Zebras allow you to see what parts of your image are too bright. As you can see in this example, zebras are present in the frame, and that means I have overexposed areas. The coolest thing about this tool is that you can set different values for it, different threshold values. For example, on the monitor, I can set values between 1 and 100%, but I will set it to 95% because if I have bright objects in the scene, I would like to avoid overexposing them. When these stripes are visible on the monitor, it's more like a warning. It means that those areas are now over 95% brightness. So I will need to dial down my exposure just until I have the minimum amount of zebra stripes on my monitor, and this way I ensure that my exposure is right. You can also use zebras to expose your skin properly. I usually expose my skin between 60 and 70%, so I set the threshold to 70% for zebras, and when I start to see stripes on my face, that means I have a good exposure for my skin. Keep in mind that everybody's skin has a different brightness, so I recommend you to check out the exposure chart made by Ansel atoms, where you will find more info about how you should expose for different things, including skin. Unfortunately, zebras are not available in the Canon EOS R, but they exist on Sony cameras, for example, or the Panasonic GH5 and other cameras as well. So tell me in the comments, what camera do you use for filmmaking, and if you have zebras in the menu. Also, drop a like if you find value in this video. Okay, next on the list is waveform scopes, and I use this a lot. It's kind of similar to the histogram, but it's not, because waveform scopes not only allow you to check if your exposure is correct on a vertical axis, the highlights at the top and the shadows at the bottom, but it will show you a clear representation on the graph where the overexposed or the underexposed object is in the frame. So if you have the sun or a bright object in the scene in the left part of the frame, for example, it will appear on the waveform in the same area, and this is super helpful. The waveform is actually a very helpful tool that you will find in video editing software like, for example, Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, and Final Cut. However, you should not rely on software, and you should make sure you expose your clips properly in the camera and then make small adjustments in post-production. Let's talk about the false color tool. This is another very helpful tool that you will find on external monitors like the Andicine A6 Plus. This tool may look unnatural to you when you see it for the first time, but it's really powerful. False color is showing you different colors for every exposure value in the frame. As an example, I know that my skin sits around the 60-70 value for exposure. When using false color, I have this representation of the values and colors at the bottom. So for my skin, as an example, the 70 value is represented by the gray color. If I overexpose the shot, you can see that my skin becomes yellow, so it's not properly exposed. It's overexposed. But if I bring the exposure down a bit until my skin becomes gray in the majority of the parts, this means I have a good starting point. This means I have a good exposure for my skin. So make sure you pay attention to your frame and scene before hitting the record button, and try to use one of these powerful tools to expose your shots correctly in camera, because this will help you a lot in post-production. I'm Chris, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.